Good morning, everybody. Simba's here right at the start today. He was eager to see y'all, apparently. Yeah, but now you're sitting on my attendance sheet. Oh, you're so cute. You can stay. I know it'll be so much better to get back to classes in person, but I am in a mess being able to just hang out with this guy all day. He's a pretty good companion. He was really funny because for the first few months of the pandemic, all three of us were home, me, my husband, and our daughter. And when I first started taking her back to her daycare, when it reopened with all the precautions, it was only 5 minutes away. And by the time I got home, 10 minutes round trip, right? He would be like at the door, like, hey, I've had people around me. Where are you? So, yes, you're a sweet boy. Alrighty. So I haven't even looked at your exams yet. I'll grade them this weekend. And then this next exam coming up is only 2 chapters, really short. And so we go through substance use disorder and we go through personality disorders. And I will take breathers when I need to here. The substance use disorder is often one where people have really good questions. So feel free to stop me at any time. Yes. Oh, thank you. I don't know if I should thank you for biting my nose, but it was a love bite. So I'm just going to dive right in. I feel like I'm a YouTuber, like Phil DeFranco. Let's just jump into it. This is, again, a fun chapter, but obviously I know for some people, this is pretty serious, especially if you have, people in your life who have struggled with drugs or alcohol, right? And I'm one of those folks, unfortunately, one side of my family that is, unfortunately rife with substance use issues. So I am familiar and I empathize, and thank you. Just blocking everything. I want to tell you that anytime I'm trying something humorous, it's not at all to be not understanding or anything like that. Simba, they don't need your random typing in the chat. Okay. All right. So we are going to start by talking about sort of how does the DSM define these things? Because it's a little bit different than we use this terminology in our day-to-day lives. So first off, the term drug here just means any substance other than food that affects our bodies and minds. So you'll see there are plenty of drugs on this list that people consume pretty frequently. So we're going to talk about caffeine, we're going to talk about nicotine, we'll talk about some of the antidepressants that can be addictive. It doesn't have to be medicine. It doesn't have to be illegal. So I think that's a really important point as well, is that, alcohol is a drug, but it is legal, right? Depending on your age. A substance is a term that's frequently used in place of drug because many people fail to see that all those things I just mentioned are drugs. So this is a nice, sort of catch-all. The short-term effects of drugs are intoxication. And when you're intoxicated, you experience a temporary state of typically poor judgment, mood changes, irritability, slurred speech, and poor coordination. And then the different substances and drugs we're going to talk about will affect your brain differently and thus have different side effects or symptoms. So, you know, like if you're taking a hallucinogenic like LSD, you may actually have hallucinations or perceptual distortions. So you think like the wall is breathing. It always makes me think of the story The Yellow Wallpaper, if you ever had to read that. Some substances can also lead to long-term problems. Really, a lot of substances that people don't even realize. And that's part of what we'll talk about today. And as I go through this, I try really hard not to be judgmental. But I also am going to tell you the drugs that I highly recommend you don't ever try, and I'll explain why. Simply because of what they do to your brain. So substance, this is something I should say here. So now we just call these substance use disorders. But in the DSM-4 and for years before that, they were called substance abuse and substance dependence. And I think that distinction is still helpful, which is why I still cover it. So substance abuse is a behavioral pattern where you rely excessively on a drug and you take it regularly. And such reliance causes damage to your life. So maybe work functioning, relationships, you could even put yourself or others at danger. For example, a mother who abuses alcohol and drives under the influence with her children in the car. Substance abuse is characterized by failure to fulfill major obligations like work or childcare, exposure to physical dangers, legal problems, you know, getting in trouble with the law, whether it's DUIs or possession, anything like that. And persistent social or interpersonal problems like arguments with your spouse. Dependence is called in our common vernacular addiction. So addiction itself is not a diagnostic term, but dependence and again, substance use disorders, these are things that we use more often. And this includes all the criteria for abuse, but the person must also center their life around the drug and the experience. So a lot of their time is spent getting the drug or recovering from its effects. The story I tell here is when I was in my fourth and fifth years of grad school, I actually lived in a apartment complex I really liked. It was little townhouses. There was an alpaca farm down the road. One of the eccentricities about it is there was a guy who had declared himself the mayor of our like 20 townhome complex. My husband was like, was there an election? But it was actually kind of sad because he would walk, but I would see him walking to the grocery store every day and coming back with a 24-pack of beer. Right, so that's taking up a lot of his time. I would imagine drinking those amount of beers is taking up a lot of his time and certainly recovering from it. You also experience physical dependence. And the big things here, sorry, Simba changed the slide, are tolerance and withdrawal. So tolerance is when you need more of the drug in order to get your desired effect, in order to essentially have the same effect. And then, sorry, I just realized there we go. I was like, why do I look weird? Oh, my ring light's on a different color. So withdrawal occurs when you try to stop taking the substance and you have unpleasant symptoms or sometimes even dangerous symptoms. So some of the drugs we're going to talk about, the substances we're going to talk about, when you try to stop them cold turkey, withdrawal symptoms can actually be fatal. So this is why it's really important to get proper medical supervision when you decide to detox. And this is not juice detoxes, right? This is actually clearing a drug out of your system. By the way, just like side note, as someone who's in the eating disorder world and thus knows a pretty decent amount about nutrition, that's not a thing. Juice cleanses are not a thing. just FYI. Like your liver and kidneys do the job, and if they're not, you need medical attention, not just a bunch of juice. So, and you will continue using the substances despite the fact that this is causing you all these problems. And it's really hard, especially some of the ones we'll talk about, to stop using them once you've started. So this is the DSM criteria for substance use disorder in general. And then if, let's say, you alcohol is your substance of choice, you would be diagnosed with alcohol use disorder. Or if it was pot, it'd be marijuana use disorder, or cannabis, I think, use disorder. And yes, that's something we'll talk about. You can actually get addicted to cannabinoids. You know, not everyone does, just like not everyone gets addicted to alcohol, but we'll talk about that. So you've got this maladaptive pattern of substance use leading to significant impairment or distress. And you have to have at least 2 of these symptoms. Typically, someone who's in a substance use disorder will have many more than 2. So you're taking larger amounts or over a longer period. So you're starting to build up that tolerance, right? You have desire or unsuccessful efforts to reduce or control, and you can't, basically. Again, not everyone's going to have that, but you only need 2 of these symptoms. You spend a lot of your time, as we just talked about, trying to get, use, or recover from, you know, in a hangover, essentially. You're not fulfilling your obligations at work, school, or home. You are using the substance despite these problems, right? These social and interpersonal problems, arguing with your spouse, having problems with your kiddos, problems at work. You are stopping or reducing important social, occupational, or recreational activities because of your use. So maybe you stop going to work, right? Because you are just using your substance all day. You're going to use it where there's possible physical danger. So whether, again, that's something using a substance and driving, or, you know, going to a place to procure the drugs that you wouldn't typically visit, right? That might be a more dangerous neighborhood, for example, probably because of the presence of drugs and all of the crime that ends up being associated with it. Continuing to use the substance despite awareness that it's causing or exacerbating problems, and these can be physical problems or psychological problems. So physical problems, depending on the substance, it can really tax your cardiovascular system, your digestive system. So I had an uncle, actually, who was the youngest out of my mom's family, but who passed away shoveling snow because he had a heart attack, because unfortunately he abused both alcohol and tobacco. And that can happen to anyone, but he, again, was fairly young, so it probably wouldn't have happened to him had he not also had the physical side effects of those substances. Tolerance effects and withdrawal effects that we just talked about, and then that craving or strong desire for the substance. So, you know, like, we have just like a wine rack filled with wine, and we like occasionally will open a bottle and have a little bit of it. Someone who is an alcoholic or had alcohol use disorder, as we would actually diagnose them, couldn't do that, right? They wouldn't be able to. They would just go through that rack pretty quickly. It's full because we usually drink wine when we have people over, and we haven't been having people over. All right, so as I mentioned, the DSM-5 combined these past 2 disorders, and this is something that is not everybody agrees with. Some people think that this is conflating the 2, and that we might not address them in the way they need to be addressed because of that. So that's really important as well. All right, so about 10% of all adults in the US display substance use disorders, but only about a quarter of that 10% get treatment. So there's 3/4 of the people who are abusing substances who aren't seeking treatment. So recent statistics suggest that drug use is a significant social problem as well. So over 28 million people in the US have used an illegal substance within the past year. Over 19 million are using them currently. almost 25% of all high school seniors have used an illegal drug within the past month. So again, maybe this isn't that alarming, right? Because again, most people can probably use a substance and not get addicted, right? Like that's an important note to keep in mind. But, you know, again, some of these can be very damaging. So it's important to really drill down and figure out, you know, sort of what are the issues that are arising, who is using them, what can we do to help them. Alrighty, so we're going to start by talking about depressants, and we're going to talk about different categories of medications and substances in general. And some of them are going to be medications, some of them will be other substances. And these are categorized by what they do to your nervous system, essentially. So depressants slow the activity of the nervous system. They depress how quickly you process things. They also reduce tension and inhibitions and can interfere with your judgment, motor activity, and concentration. The three most widely used groups are alcohol, sedative hypnotic drugs, and opioids. It's important to note that alcohol is legal and the other two are prescription drugs, right? So I think it's really important to note that these are not all illegal things, right? People can form substance use disorder to things that are helpful to other people, or again, with the case of alcohol, some people can just drink socially every once in a while and be fine, right? So again, this is where I don't want to have judgment, but just recognize that for some people, and more it's looking at likely partially because of biology, genetics, but also because of maybe socialization, things along those lines, traumatic experiences in their past, things along those lines. Just they have a very different experience with these medications and other substances. All right, so we'll talk about alcohol just because I think this is the most commonly used substance probably in general, with the exception of caffeine. We'll talk about that one later. And alcoholic beverages contain ethyl alcohol, which is absorbed through the lining of the stomach and the intestines. And as I just mentioned, it depresses the activity of the central nervous system. So that makes you less inhibited because it's essentially depressing the function of your executive function. So the part that usually kind of holds you back. And more talkative, maybe relaxed. Eventually you're going to get some slurred speech, and it's going to affect your ability to make sound judgments. The extent of the effect of alcohol on a person is determined by blood alcohol concentration. So if 0.06% of the blood contains alcohol, you typically feel relaxed and comfortable. If your blood alcohol level is 0.09, you're considered intoxicated. Now, I looked this up several years ago, so I think this is still true, that for every state right now, the legal limit to drive is 0.08. So it's right before you get to that intoxication point. So you could not feel drunk, but have enough alcohol in your system that you shouldn't be driving. And that's really important to note. Actually, one of my favorite YouTubers or YouTube groups is the Try Guys. And they did a really interesting video about this maybe 5 years or so ago, where they like partied and like took breathalyzers throughout the night. And they were very different in their experiences of it. And they were very bad at guessing when they were actually intoxicated. If your blood alcohol content goes very high, like let's say the 0.55 level, that may lead to death. So what happens when someone dies as a result of alcohol poisoning is, so it depresses different parts of your brain, and the last part of your brain that it depresses the function of is your brainstem, which does things like tell you to breathe and tell your heart to beat. So when that slows down enough, So does the rest of your body. This is honestly, this is going to sound weird, but like a high level is that's sort of hard to get to. So these are often the people who try to do 21 shots when they turn 21. Don't do that. It's unnecessary. Your body can't handle it. Or, you know, other large intakes of alcohol. The other thing, which we'll talk about in a couple slides, I have a chart, is that this will vary based on your gender, your body composition, and also your experience or tolerance. The only way to get the effects of alcohol out of the way to subside is by decreasing the alcohol concentration in your blood. And so this happens through a process called metabolization. And the liver is going to break down the alcohol into carbon dioxide and water. And then you either excrete the water or exhale the carbon dioxide. So really, people will say all these things that they have, like, oh, I drink coffee or hot sauce, whatever, to sober up. You might feel more alert, but your blood alcohol content isn't going to change as a result. So you really just have to take time. Even showers or pulling yourself together won't do anything. So especially in this day and age, if you're at all unsure, just call an Uber, call a Lyft, whatever your favorite company is for that. You know, go get your car the next day. It's just not worth it. Like, don't try to drink and drive. It's horrific. All right, so this is one of my favorite diagrams because it shows how alcohol affects your brain in sequence. So when you're just starting to drink, your blood alcohol concentration is pretty low. That's when it's affecting your prefrontal cortex. So that's going to get at your emotions, also your inhibitions. And then it's going to start working on, you know, sort of the temporal and parietal lobes. So that's going to look at things like your judgment and your voluntary motor skills. When you start to get up in that 0.4 to 0.6, so again, not 0.04, but 0.4, that's when it's going to slow down and depress that involuntary system. And again, that's unfortunately when people can die from this. And so here is that chart. And so this is really important, is to think about, like, what is a drink, right? So if we're thinking about 1 ounce of alcohol, absolute alcohol, and we're looking at, you know, maybe 2 ounces of spirits, 2 glasses of wine, 2 cans of beer, right? And this is within an hour, okay? Because this is sort of relative to how your body can process it. But let's say you are a teeny tiny person, right? You weigh 100 pounds just naturally. That's who you are. Different people have different body shapes, right? Just from having half of that, having 1 ounce of spirits, 1 glass of wine, 1 can of beer, we're already at the like 0.04 or 0.03 level, right? And by the time you've had those 2, again, if you're really skinny, you might be over the legal limit or really close to it, right? And again, this will also depend on tolerance, experience, things like that. You know, if you have some sort of kidney or liver condition, that's going to cause a problem, right? And then you can just see, if you up that intake in an hour, we start to get to that danger zone pretty quickly, unfortunately. So again, drinking, you can drink and enjoy it, but just like pace it so that your body can process it, right? So if you get to a party and you do have, you know, 4 cans of beer in the first hour, maybe drink water for a little bit before you have another one to give your body some time to catch up. It also will help with a hangover the next day. So, all right, so let's talk about some of the history of alcohol use here in the US. So in colonial America, alcohol was actually viewed really positively. It was actually viewed as a gift from God. Alcohol was believed to be associated with good physical health, in large part due to the lack of clean, potable drinking water. At that time, people who did not drink alcohol actually had to pay higher life insurance rates, about 10% higher than people who drink, because of the commonality of waterborne illnesses. A brewery was one of Harvard College's first construction projects, so that a steady supply of beer could be served in the student dining halls. And George Washington brewed alcohol at Mount Vernon and was an outspoken proponent of making sure soldiers during the Revolutionary War got their rations of beer daily. So then we get into more of our like alternate history here. Sorry, there's cat hair everywhere. All right. So America has always had this like push-pull on alcohol use. I think partially because of our push-pull and how we were founded, right? So here in Virginia, we had the Virginia Company, which was all about capitalism, right? All about trying to find treasure and get money. And then up in Massachusetts, we had the Puritans who came for religious freedom, right? And were where the word puritanical came from, right? And so we've always had this push-pull of like, are we this moral society or are we this, who cares, let's make a lot of money society? And so in 1790, Benjamin Rush, the same guy that developed those chairs and all that stuff we talked about at the beginning of the semester, he described drunkenness as an uncontrollable disease and saw alcohol itself as the cause of the abuse. And many came to view it as demon rum. In 1830, the American Temperance Society changed to the Abstinence Society. So they changed from be careful how you drink to don't drink. After decades of unprecedented drinking, they decided the only way to prevent drunkenness was to eliminate the consumption of alcohol entirely. And they said that any consumption of alcohol is alcohol abuse. That certainly is not modern medical or psychological definition. I'm going to have a lot of these throughout this because I think it's really interesting to see how these things used to be advertised. So the joys of motherhood, Pabst abstracts. Yes, this is PBR, right? And then Anheuser-Busch's Malt Nutrien. Now, there is a little bit of truth to this. Dark beers in particular can help mothers lactate. But the fact that it used to be advertised specifically for this, right, is very interesting. So in 1849, Magnus Huss, who was a Swedish physician, created the diagnostic entity of alcoholism, what we now call alcohol use disorder. In 1855, there were international conferences devoted to temperance activities, scientific research, and alcohol control policy. The first one was held in Antwerp, and this research was tied to the temperance movement. And then in 1887, there was the Women's Christians Temperance Union, and this was a major force pushing for the total prohibition of alcohol. And here are some of the scientific facts, the fake news, put forth by this organization. So the majority of beer drinkers die from dropsy. When alcohol passes down the throat, it burns off the skin. It causes the heart to beat. And then after the first dose, you have to keep drinking or your heart will stop beating. If that happened, that would be really problematic, but that's not what happened. And then maybe my favorite one, it turns the blood to water, like it's some sort of like reverse Jesus or something, right? So I think that's, again, fake news, has been around for a really long time. And these people, again, had good intentions, but unfortunately were misrepresenting the facts. So in 1920, pressure from groups like that and other groups as well led to prohibition. And this was called the Noble Experiment. And it was touted as the magical solution to the nation's crime, violence, and other ills. However, people found plenty of ways to smuggle or otherwise obtain alcohol. So this is a raid during Prohibition. As you can see, there's not a small amount of alcohol there. And then this is like something out of a spy movie, that you could actually put a vial of alcohol in the heel of a high heel shoe. Prohibition ads were very popular at this time as well. Obviously, this has been colored in the afterwards. Here's another one. Help me to keep him pure. Yeah, the idea of like using purity or spotlessness, or it's got all kinds of like class and racial and other tones to it, right? So in 1933, happy days are here again. Prohibition was repealed. It was ineffective, and an amazing 1.5 barrels of alcohol were consumed during the first 24 hours that alcohol was legal again. So Prohibition was very much a failure in preventing alcohol use and problems. Its largest impact was really to change the drinking institutions of America. So prior to this, if you've ever seen like Westerns or even the movie Back to the Future 3, right? Saloons were where you went to drink publicly. And they were often sort of dusty and rowdy, and, would have prostitutes circulating. During Prohibition, you had the era of cocktail lounges and cabarets that often only those in the know or who had the money could attend. So drinking became much more sophisticated. And we definitely see elements of this today, right? So you have your dive bars versus, your cocktail bars, or people now really like a good speakeasy, which is essentially just replicating the experience of what it would have been like to go to one of these clubs during Prohibition. All right, so Alcoholics Anonymous was founded in 1935, so 2 years after Prohibition was repealed. And this was by Bill W. and Dr. Bob S. In 1939, they published the book that's called Alcoholics Anonymous, or what people within the program called the Big Book. And Dr. Bob was really integrated and involved in implementing AA in hospital settings. And AA's principles and the 12 steps remain very common in inpatient programs today. So I went to graduate school in Kent, Ohio. The next town over, where I actually got married, is Akron, Ohio. And so Dr. Bob and Bill W. had their first meeting at Dr. Bob's house on Ardmore Avenue in Akron. I've actually been. It's kind of cool. They've made it a little museum, basically. And they show you, like, here are the bedrooms where, like, before inpatient was a thing, they kind of made their own inpatient facilities for this. And they were introduced by a mutual friend, Henrietta Sieberling, at the Gate Lodge of Stan Hewitt Hall in Akron. Stan Hewitt Hall now is like one of the plantations around here that you can visit. Not that I'm like comfortable with visiting a plantation for tourism, unless they do a lot of good education about slavery. Anyway, but it was like an event venue as well as like a historical home you could visit. But at the time, it was just this mansion. And Dr. Bob began treating alcoholics at St. Thomas Hospital in Akron, which is actually where I did my placement during my 4th year of graduate school. So even though I myself have never actually focused specifically on treating alcoholism, I've certainly worked with people who've struggled with alcohol. I have all these really cool ties to it. All right, so alcohol use disorders. Again, it's called alcoholism in the lay vernacular. That's not necessarily what we should call it based on our diagnostics. So it's considered to be a long-term pattern of abuse or dependence. 13 to 18% of the nation's adults display one of the two patterns of alcohol abuse in their lives. Men are much more common in terms of alcohol abuse. And it's not the term, again, alcoholism, the reason why we don't use it, it's not very exact or scientific, right? So alcohol use disorder itself occurs when someone drinks alcohol excessively on a regular basis and is relying on alcohol to do things that would otherwise make them anxious. So, for example, needing to drink every time you interact socially or before you go to class, things along those lines. Alcohol consumption interferes with their relationships, work, their ability to think clearly. They can have tolerance to it where they need to drink more alcohol to feel the same effects. They can have withdrawal, and actually withdrawal symptoms from alcohol can be severe, depending on, again, the length of time and how severe the tolerance is. So they can experience physical side effects. So their hands, tongue, and eyelids might shake. They might feel weak and nauseous. They might sweat and vomit, and they might experience an increase in heart rate and blood pressure. And again, this is why it's really important if you are going to go through withdrawal to do so under the care of a medical facility, because if something happens, say, with your heart rate, they're right there to help you. A small percentage of people who are dependent on alcohol experience a severe withdrawal reaction called delirium tremens. And here they have visual hallucinations where they see animals chasing or crawling on them or objects dancing in front of their eyes. They may also experience seizures, loss of consciousness, and even death as a result of delirium tremens. So again, I think we sort of tend to whatever for alcohol use disorder because it's so common, but it can be fatal in a lot of different ways, including withdrawal. So alcohol is absorbed into the blood and takes effect through the stomach lining. It takes effect in the bloodstream and the central nervous system. So in terms of how it actually works within the brain, it blocks messages between the neurons. And in particular, it helps GABA, which is that inhibitory messenger, shut down neurons and basically relax the drinker. It's, again, depressing these functions by creating more opportunity for GABA to inhibit things. The first brain area is that one that has judgment, inhibition, emotion. Then we've got speaking and memory, where you might slur your speech, might not remember what happened to you well. And then motor difficulties increasing as drinking continues and reaction time slow. And eventually it reaches the areas that control those basic functionings, as we've mentioned. And again, that in and of itself can cause death. There are also personal and societal consequences. It can destroy your relationships, family relationships, your career. It costs society $148 billion annually. This is often a figure that's calculated based not only on medical care, but also lost hours at work, things along those lines. It plays a role in a third of all suicides, homicides, rapes, and other assaults. 41% of all fatal auto accidents involve alcohol, 41%. Another thing that can happen if you are a heavy, repeated user of alcohol is Korsakoff syndrome. And this is a disorder resulting from heavy drinking that's marked by confusion, memory impairment, both anterograde, so making new memories, and retrograde, what happened before, and other neurological impairment. So what happens is that people who drink heavily feel full, because alcohol does have calories, or at least alcoholic beverages do, which lowers the desire for food, so they actually can suffer from malnutrition, and in particular, vitamin B deficiency. And that's what causes these symptoms of Korsakoff syndrome, is thiamine or vitamin B deficiency. So after research started coming out about Korsakoffs, liquor companies started putting vitamin B in their alcohol so that their best customers would stay alive longer. Yeah, what a solution, right? Also, mothers who drink alcohol heavily and regularly while pregnant may deliver babies with fetal alcohol syndrome. This is a little controversial. There are some doctors who say you should never drink alcohol. Over in Europe, a lot of women will have a glass of wine a week, a glass of wine a day, and their rates of fetal alcohol syndrome are no higher than ours. But it certainly can happen when you are heavily using it, right, and consistently using it. So babies with fetal alcohol syndrome have a cluster of problems, including developmental delays, low birth weight, hyperactivity, head and face deformities, heart defects, and slow growth. And somewhere in the order of 1 to 2 out of every 1,000 babies are born with fetal alcohol syndrome. So one thing that I think it's important to talk about, just because I know that drinking is such a big part of college culture, right? And again, no judgment about that, but we need to just be careful about its use so that you all protect your health. So, and in fact, it's sort of interesting because I think a lot of times in college students, they might qualify for an alcohol use disorder, but they're not diagnosed because it's considered sort of normative to the culture. So we called this like college drinking not otherwise specified when we were in graduate school. But so binge drinking in and of itself is 5 or more drinks in 2 hours for men, 4 or more drinks in 2 hours for women. If you binge drink, you're 14 times more likely to drive drunk and get unintentional injuries. So these are the stories where you hear someone like was dancing on a table and fell off and broke their arm, right? Or even intentional injuries. So people that self-harm or people that purposely engage in stupid things they know will probably cause them harm. You're more likely to get an STD, STI because you're less likely to think you need to use protection. You can experience sexual dysfunction, particularly in men. Some of the erectile issues we talked about in our sexual disorders chapter. And then, as we talked about before, alcohol poisoning when you've drunk so much that it shuts down that brainstem. So these are the critical signs and symptoms of alcohol poisoning. I always include these just because I want you all to know, in case you ever encounter someone who has this, immediately call for help. Like, don't joke around. Don't worry about whether the person will get in trouble. My understanding from talking to Keith Moore and other people on campus is you and that person get immunity, essentially, from any sort of underage drinking charge or anything like that, because they want to keep that person alive, right? So the person seems confused, if they're in a stupor, if they just can't be roused, they seem like they're in a coma, vomiting and seizures, if they're breathing fewer than 8 breaths per minute, that means it's gotten to the brainstem and it's starting to depress that function, right? Or irregular breathing when there's a lot of time between breaths. Hypothermia, so low body temperature, because again, the brainstem helps with regulating body temperature. So paleness and bluish skin color can go along with that. If you don't get help for a person with alcohol poisoning, they can choke on their own vomit. They can just stop breathing. Their heart can stop beating. Again, we mentioned hypothermia. We can have hypoglycemia, where you have too little blood sugar and you can actually have seizures as a result of that. They can get severe dehydration from vomiting, and that can also cause seizures and brain damage or death. And binge drinking is especially dangerous because you can ingest a fatal dose before you are unconscious because you're drinking so quickly. So things like pre-gaming, and again, like drinking a lot at the start of the party can be pretty dangerous. So again, don't be afraid to seek medical help. Don't worry that your friend will be angry or embarrassed. Be safe, not sorry, and get them help. So know these signs. Don't wait to be like, oh, but they're still conscious, right? That might be too late, right? Be aware that the person who has passed out they don't necessarily will, but it's possible they could die. So just call 911 for help. I understand that on campus, they also want you to call security so that they know where to direct the ambulance when it gets there. All right, so now we're going to talk about some of the other depressant medications. So the sedative hypnotics, these are anxiolytics. These are prescription anxiety reducing drugs. And they've been shown to produce relaxation and drowsiness. In low doses, they have this calming or sedative effect, but in high doses, they can actually be a sleep aid. And the two main types here are barbiturates and benzodiazepines. So we'll talk about barbiturates first. So these are an addictive drug. They are, again, used to reduce anxiety or help people sleep. And here, just like alcohol, they increase GABA. They increase that inhibitory neurotransmitter. In too high of doses, they do have an intoxication effect. So it can cause sleep or other side effects. And it does this by depressing the reticular formation, which is the part of the brain that helps people stay awake. So it's sort of like it tells that part of the brain, we can go to sleep now. You can turn off for a little bit. People may abuse the drugs for its calming effect, and dependence will develop where they use more of the drug to get the same effect. So they're taking more than is prescribed. And this is especially dangerous because the lethal dose remains the same regardless of your tolerance. So even if you feel like you need more and more of the drug, you'll eventually hit that lethal dose. Some of the withdrawal symptoms here include nausea, anxiety, maybe not surprisingly, since it's an anti-anxiety drug, sleep problems, again, it helps you sleep. So when you stop taking it, you can end up with sleep difficulties, and convulsions. So it can resemble the same withdrawal symptoms as delirium tremens that we just talked about with alcohol. And here you see some of the barbiturates on screen. So again, these are all prescription meds that can be abused. So here are some ads related to that. When crisis demands quick-acting hypnotics. And as you can see, a lot of these are gendered. So pentobarbital, phenobarbital, common ones you may have even heard of. But this one, Mabel is unstable. Right, anyway. Yeah, and so the Butasol sodium. So you may have heard of Butasol. It's a brand name as well. Again, these used to just be advertised as these are things that will help you get over just being upset about being a housewife. And even more so, the benzodiazepines were the same thing. So these were actually called Mother's Little Helper in the 1950s and 1960s because they were commonly prescribed to women who often had gone to college, had bachelor's degrees, and then were relegated to being housewives and mothers. And so this caused a lot of anxiety. This is what Betty Friedan wrote her book about. And so she talked about it as the problem that has no name. And like barbiturates, they also produce calming effects by increasing GABA. However, they're less likely to cause death in the event of an overdose, so that's good. Because they don't affect the reticular formation. They don't affect your brainstem as much. They're not going to affect your breathing as much. High doses can cause intoxication and lead to abuse or dependence. About 1% of adults will develop barbiturate use disorder and become physically dependent on these anti-anxiety drugs. Okay, now we have to talk about the big one, right? So if you've heard about the opioid crisis, this is what we're going to talk about, okay? So there are lots of different types of opioids, and the original opioids were made from the opium flower. It's a poppy, the sap of the opium poppy, and it reduces pain, but it's also highly addictive. One of the natural derivatives of opioids is morphine. It's very effective in pain relief. If you've ever had any sort of surgery, they often will give you a morphine drip, for example, afterwards. But they know how addictive it is, and so they actually will not prescribe this for you at home. The other type of natural opioid derivative is heroin. Okay, so think about this. We are giving people something in the hospital, again, carefully regulated, but that is really similar to heroin. Right? It's a little mind-boggling. But again, it's one of the most effective pain relievers, so we haven't come up with good alternatives necessarily. Heroin is one of the most addictive substances period, much less derived from opium. Heroin is illegal, although again, morphine is approved to be used in inpatient settings. Opioids in general are also known as narcotics. And so when you hear someone talk about like the narcotics division of a police station, although they handle all drugs, the term narcotic refers to opioids. And so what type of effects does an opioid produce? And there are other opioids that can prescribe you, I should say that, outside of it, that are not as something like more potent, there we go, as morphine, but have many of the same things. You can create synthetic opioids as well, and methadone is an example. That is a drug that's actually used to help people step down off heroin. Here are some of the ads for opium-infused products that used to be here. So soothing syrup for children who were teething, a cough syrup. I mean, again, this is not too far out of the realm, right? If you think about how we have Tylenol with codeine now, and codeine is a pain reliever that, again, different people have different reactions to. I get totally out of it when I take codeine. After I had my wisdom teeth out, I lost a spoon 3 times in the car. Thank God my mother was driving me. And so, again, these things used to just be thrown into everyday products. It's kind of funny, like a parallel with it now, right, is CBD oil. Like my new shampoo that my stylist gave me has CBD oil in it. I'm thinking, my hair gonna get high? Like, what's the actual benefits? And I've researched it and they're not really clear. But so far my hair looks great, so I'll just roll with it. So what are the effects? So if you are taking opioids, you are initially going to experience what's called a rush. And this is a spasm of warmth and ecstasy. Some people actually compare it to an orgasm. And the rush is followed by several hours of a high or a nod. And this is when the person feels very relaxed, happy, and unconcerned about basic bodily needs, food, sex, water. And these effects are created by depressing the central nervous system, particularly the centers that help control emotions. Opioids also attach to brain receptor sites that usually receive endorphins. And endorphins, if anyone remembers Legally Blonde, right? Exercise gives you endorphins, and endorphins make you happy, and happy people just don't kill people. They just don't, right? So endorphins give you a sense of pleasure, relaxation, and a reduction of pain. And so, again, these effects feel great. That's why people are going to keep using them and perhaps use them in a higher dose than prescribed. So heroin in particular, again, highly addictive. Within 2 to 3 weeks, its use can lead to abuse. So that quickly. Alcohol often takes much longer. Some of the other substances take much longer. 2 to 3 weeks. You are immediately experiencing decline in your functioning. You are building tolerance effects, and you would experience withdrawal if you stopped using it. So heroin is on my list of don't ever do this drug for this reason, okay? Just again, it's not worth the risk to your brain or your personal well-being. Dependence quickly follows abuse. The user centers their life around heroin. They build up that tolerance and withdrawal. They get anxious, restless, they sweat, their breathing gets more rapid, they twitch, they have aches, fever, vomiting, diarrhea, loss of appetite, high blood pressure, things along those lines when they stop. And about 1% of adults, as we just talked about with the other medications, become addicted to heroin or other opioids at some point in their lives. This is an old stat. I would guess this is higher now, given, again, the opioid crisis. And one thing, just like side note about the opioid crisis is that part of why it happened is that drug companies blatantly lied to physicians and told them these medications don't have any addictive effects. And so physicians were like, great, and they prescribed them. And they knew that it had addictive effects, and they were just not disclosing them. And so this is why many pharmaceutical companies have been sued as a result of this and are losing these cases because it's clear it was a cover-up. Again, here are some former Bayer products. So we still have Bayer aspirin, but they used to just sell Bayer heroin, which was the sedative for coughs. And then here's another one, you know, a cure for coughing. And again, not that dissimilar from Tylenol with codeine, but much more dangerous. So obviously, dangers of heroin use include overdose. If you overdose on heroin, it will essentially shut down the respiratory center of the brain, paralyzing your breathing. Another problem is unpure heroin. This is a problem with a lot of drugs that end up being sort of like processed or manufactured in a lab, right? Is that dealers will mix in cheaper drugs or fillers, and sometimes these are deadly substances, and then you experience health problems. You don't really know what's in it, right? Also, heroin is commonly injected just below the surface of the skin. So people who share needles, use unsterile equipment, run the risk of contracting things like HIV or hepatitis. So as many as 60% of heroin users in the US have HIV. And this is one of the reasons why some cities are doing needle exchanges. Not because they actually want to encourage people to keep using heroin, but because they know they are going to, and they want to cut down on the risks of HIV and hepatitis spread. All right, so now we're going to start talking about stimulants. These have the opposite effect on the brain. So these are going to increase the activity of your CNS. So they'll increase your blood pressure, your heart rate, your alertness. They'll speed up your behavior and your thinking. It can almost be like you're having a manic episode when you're on a stimulant. So the ones we're going to talk about here are cocaine, caffeine, we're going to talk about tobacco or nicotine, and then amphetamines. So methamphetamine is an example of this. All right, so cocaine itself is highly addictive. It's the most powerful natural stimulant. This would be on my list of just don't bother. It's not worth it for your body. So heroin, cocaine, the other big ones we'll talk about are like ecstasy. That one's probably the worst for direct effects on your brain. But cocaine is frequently used by teenagers and young adults, so folks in your age range. In fact, nearly 5% of high schoolers have used cocaine within the past year, and then approximately 3% of the population has become dependent on cocaine. So the effects here are similar to the effects of some of the other drugs we've talked about, like heroin. So first you will have a euphoric rush, and the person's overwhelmed by feelings of confidence and overall well-being. You can see how that would be a very seductive feeling, right? So at first, cocaine stimulates the higher centers of the nervous system and makes us feel excited, energetic, talkative, and even euphoric. Then, as more is taken in, it stimulates other centers of the central nervous system, increasing the heart rate, blood pressure, breathing, and physiological arousal in general. And it causes the effects by stimulating the increased release of dopamine in the brain. So the depressants were working mostly on GABA. Cocaine and the other stimulants are going to work on some of these other neurotransmitters like dopamine. So after dopamine is released in the brain, cocaine prevents neurons from reabsorbing the dopamine. And it causes, sorry, I lost my place for a minute. Normally I have pretty clear bullet points, and this is like a paragraph. It prevents the neurons from reabsorbing the dopamine. So it's like an SSRI, it's blocking reuptake. And that increases the amount of time the dopamine is in the synapse, which then increases the effects of the dopamine. And dopamine is a neurotransmitter that causes feelings of pleasure, euphoria, and arousal. And the abundance of dopamine in the synapse of neurons prolongs and increases these pleasurable feelings. Oops, sorry. So you also get really talkative and energetic and euphoric as part of this. So cocaine has been looked at as a cure, just like some of these other drugs as well. It became popular in the latter half of the 19th century. Freud himself thought it might be a cure for depression, but other people looked at it for headaches. Freud is believed to have become addicted to cocaine. He claimed it produced euphoria and thus would work as an antidepressant. Sure, but only for really short periods of time, right? Cocaine was an ingredient in many soft drinks and other products, and most notably Coca-Cola, which sometimes they deny and sometimes they admit to, depending on sort of the era we're in. So here are some of the ads for this. So tired, then drink Coca-Cola. It relieves exhaustion. Again, similar to my CBD shampoo, cocaine for the hair. Again, is it stimulating it? I don't know what's happening. Cocaine tooth drops, or if you have a toothache, right? So again, we've sort of evolved over the years. So how are these effects produced? High doses of cocaine can lead to cocaine-induced psychotic disorders, where the user displays features in which he or she hallucinates or has delusions. And as the effects of cocaine wear off, we see what's called a crash. And when this happens, the person feels depressed because all that cocaine's out of their system. So they're not getting those euphoric effects anymore. They have headaches, dizziness. They can even faint, pass out. And they often sink into a deep sleep. And again, if it's a huge crash, they can even sink into a coma. So use disorders here have increased. In the past, the effects of cocaine were limited because of its high cost and because it was difficult to get. But it's become cheaper and also more powerful. So more people can get access to the drug. And also, they get high more quickly. It's gotten more powerful through procedures like freebasing, which is a technique in which pure cocaine is chemically separated from the processed cocaine through vaporization. Hi, can I help you? You have something to add about cocaine? No, you don't take any drugs but catnip. Then the drug is more potent, essentially. Millions more people use crack, which is sometimes referred to as crack cocaine. And this is a type of freebase cocaine that's produced by boiling cocaine down into crystalline balls. And it's called crack because it actually makes a crackling noise when it's inhaled. It's sold in small quantities at low cost. And drug dealers know to go in and manipulate this in impoverished neighborhoods. So people that are already feeling awful, having really not great life experiences, it's a business venture, right? They can make a lot of money off those fix and sort of devil may care what happens to them as a result. So this has led to epidemics of crack cocaine use among people who previously could not have afforded cocaine, again, particularly those in poor urban areas. And interestingly, the opioid crisis typically is, we see it everywhere, but it's really bad in poor rural areas. So again, drug dealers, people who use these things to profit, know who to take advantage of, which is awful. So what are the dangers of cocaine? So it can cause dangerous behaviors like violent crimes, where people rob, steal, and even kill for the drug. And it's been shown to lead to risky sexual behavior, where people will actually prostitute themselves for access to the drug. In addition to behavioral problems, it has many negative physical side effects, especially associated with overdose. While it first causes the respiratory center of the brain to speed up, in excessive doses, it actually starts to work like a depressant, and it depresses breathing. It stops your breathing. And because the heart beats erratically and rapidly when you are under the influence of cocaine, the heart is forced to work harder to pump blood through the body. However, because of its stimulant effects, the veins constrict and become narrower. So you have a vasoconstrictor, right? So it's tighter veins. And then now you're trying to push more blood through those tighter veins. Imagine like a hose with a kink in it, right? And then they're more likely to experience a heart attack or at least have some sort of heart or cardiac related issue. If they're used while someone is pregnant, they're more likely to have a miscarriage, or if the child is delivered, they're more likely to have immune abnormalities, and they're more susceptible to disease and infection. They can have attention and learning deficits that show up later in life. They can have thyroid problems, and also abnormal levels of serotonin and dopamine in the brain, which, as we've talked about all semester, lead to all manner of psychological issues. All right, next we're going to talk about the amphetamines. Again, these are a major problem in this day and age. Again, these are another thing that people use to prey on poor rural folks quite a bit, but they're certainly in our cities as well. At some point, when I was on internship, I was told that Charlotte, North Carolina is actually the meth capital of the South. So the more you know, I guess. So these are stimulant drugs. They're manufactured in laboratories, right? So like, think Breaking Bad, think people who have created laboratories in their basements, things along those lines, right? So these might not be the most sterile or clean facilities, right? When amphetamines are taken in small doses, they increase energy and alertness and reduce appetite. Because they increase alertness, athletes have actually used them as a way to try to enhance their performance. Depending on your sport, this may not be illegal, right? And because they decrease appetite, they are one of the primary components in diet pills. So if you've ever seen those diet pill ads that are like, more weight loss, faster weight loss, energy to burn, that's because you're basically taking meth, right? So very problematic. When you take them in a large dose, you get a rush, intoxication, and psychosis. So you're hallucinating, experiencing cognitive distortions. And again, here are some of those ads for amphetamines. A victim of overeating and oversitting. Take biphetamine. Appetite curb, mild invigoration, predictable weight loss, right? And then again, very gendered, lady out of the dark. It's a silken motor stimulant and antidepressant, again, for short periods of time. So how do they work? Well, they actually stimulate the nervous system and cause it to produce norepinephrine, dopamine, and serotonin. And those all have pleasurable, energizing effects. Tolerance to these builds up pretty darn quickly, which increases the likelihood of becoming dependent on the drug. So you might start to use the drug as an appetite suppressant, and then you find that after a while of taking it, your appetite isn't being suppressed anymore. So then you've got to increase your dosage to get the same effects again. And people who depend on the drug, if they stop taking it, the withdrawal is fairly severe. They plunge into a deep depression and experience extended sleep, pretty similar to the withdrawal symptoms of cocaine. And again, this number is probably an underestimate because it's a little bit of an older statistic. And again, things like meth and other amphetamines have become pretty dangerous. All right, so caffeine. right? I'm not drinking, and this is actually just water. Sometimes I do have caffeine in the morning when I'm teaching here. But, you know, caffeine in general, not going to be as problematic as the other two stimulants we've just talked about, but we discuss it here in this class because it is the most widely used stimulant in the world. People in the United States alone consume 30 million pounds of caffeine annually. Caffeine stimulates the central nervous system, and like other stimulants, it causes an increase in dopamine, norepinephrine, and serotonin in the brain. Makes you feel good. So it's an increase in arousal and motor activity and a decrease in fatigue. It can also interfere with your sleep and your sleep hygiene, and it increases your rate of breathing and gastric acid secretions in the stomach, which is why some people who drink a lot of coffee will actually develop ulcers. Now, if someone has heavy caffeine use, we're talking more than 2 or 3 cups of coffee pretty quickly, you can actually experience caffeine intoxication, where you get restless, nervous, anxious, you have stomach disturbances, you might twitch and have an increased heart rate. So if you've ever been really jittery after drinking something highly caffeinated, you're experiencing caffeine intoxication. If you go as extreme as to drink 100 cups of coffee very quickly, you can actually get a grand mal seizure and respiratory failure, which of course would be fatal. Again, rare. Would be pretty hard, right, to have this happen. But I think it's important to note that dose effects are really important, right? So you'll often hear people talk about things being toxic, or everything has or like this has chemicals, this doesn't have chemicals. Well, like everything's made of chemicals, right? Dihydrogen monoxide is a chemical that makes up about 75 to 80% of our body, just water, right? But if you consume dihydrogen monoxide in excessive amounts, you can die from it, right? You can drown. There was a horrible story when I think I was in either college or grad school, where there was like a radio contest to win Miley Cyrus tickets, I think. And they were having parents drink a lot of water, and one of the contestants actually died as a result. So it really isn't about something being toxic versus not. It's about the dose effects, right? So there are things that might be lethal in really high amounts that you can have a little bit of and be fine. And caffeine's an example, so is water. Now, in terms of withdrawal, yeah, you can get withdrawal from caffeine, and some of you may have experienced this. So it's found if someone consumes their usual amount of caffeine for 2 days and then consumes no caffeine for 2 days, they experience withdrawal. And these symptoms include headaches, depression, anxiety, and fatigue. So again, some of you may have experienced this. My husband experiences this if he tries to stop drinking coffee. He essentially gets like migraine headaches when he never gets them otherwise. So it certainly does have implications. All right, I'm going to stop there, and we'll start with nicotine on Tuesday. And then, oh, wow. So Haley is sharing this. That there was another case where someone drank too much water and died. And then Allie says, yeah, when you stop to try to stop to drink coffee, the headaches are terrible. Exactly. You're experiencing withdrawal from caffeine. And of course, it doesn't have to be coffee in this day and age. It can be your energy drinks, your Monsters, all that good stuff. Your triple shot espressos, right? I guess that's coffee, but just a very different type. So thanks for sharing your experiences and what you've heard. I can stick around for another few minutes if anyone has any questions they want to run off me. Like I said, I'll grade your exams over the weekend. And then we will go forward for the next, believe it or not, after today, we only have 3 more class periods for the semester, and then it will be exam time. So I will see you all next Tuesday, if not before. Take care of yourselves.
Hi. Haley and I were looking at the syllabus and we noticed we were supposed to schedule a meeting with you today regarding our final.
Hey, Miranda, if you're trying to talk for whatever reason, I can't hear you. I don't know why.
Oh my gosh. Hold on.
Yeah, it's weird. I can see your mouth moving, but I can't
Can you hear me now?
Okay, wait, I'll join again.
You want to just type in the
I'll
chat?
try to join
That's
again.
fine.
I don't know. I can't type this.
Yeah, that's weird. It happens to the best of us. Like, I have another student who, like, it won't work for the first, like, 30 seconds she talks. Yes, yeah. So, meeting for the final projects, everyone in your group. You can do it anytime in the next couple weeks. That's fine. A time that works for your whole group, and then just schedule a meeting on my Calendly. That's okay. Yeah, I basically, like, I gave deadlines, but this semester I'm just like, whatever. It's a weird year. So, but I try to give, the deadlines are guidelines, put it that way, to give you an idea of around when you should be doing these things. So yeah, if you could do it in the next week or so, that'd be good, just so it'll help you prep for the presentation.
Are we supposed to set it up on the Google
Oh.
Doc thing?
Hold on.
Or the Google Meet? Whatever.
I don't know.
Sam.
You can do it, so you do it on, my link, and it can either be a Google Meet or a Zoom, whichever you prefer. You're welcome. Yeah, I'm sorry your mic isn't working, but we find ways to make it work. So you too. Have a good weekend. All right, Charleston or Ryan, either of you guys have any questions I can answer?